Monsieur le Président de l'Union africaine, Excellences, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. President Mohamed Ould Ghazouani, thank you for your leadership in the outstanding exercise of your mandate. Presidente João Lourenço, parabéns e aguardo com expectativa a oportunidade de trabalhar consigo como novo Presidente da União Africana. I also want to give a very special expression of gratitude to the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki, for his 8 years of strong and permanent commitment to multilateralism and impeccable cooperation with the United Nations. Cher Moussa, travailler avec toi est un privilège, un plaisir et un honneur. Excellencies, the partnership between the African Union and the United Nations has never been stronger. Together, we see an Africa booming with hope and possibility. You have a booming, enterprising population, including the largest number of young people in the world. The African continental free trade is poised to turbocharge the region's economy, and calls to address the legacies of colonialism and slavery are growing louder, as reflected in your theme this year, and as reflected in the leadership of so many passionate voices for the liberation of Africa, such as the great Dr. Sam Nujoma of Namibia, whose life we celebrate and whose loss we mourn. The world must never forget that Africa is the victim of two colossal and compounded injustices. First, the profound impact of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. The roots stretch back centuries, and the bitter fruit continues to affect Africans and people of African descent to this day. Decolonization alone in itself was not a panacea. Political independence did not free countries from structures based on exploitation and decades of economic, social, and institutional underinvestment. It is high time for reparatory justice frameworks to be put in place. Second, Africa was under colonial domination when today's multilateral system was created, and that injustice endures. Look no further than the United Nations Security Council. There is no excuse that Africa still lacks permanent representation in the 21st century. I will keep working with the African Union and all member states to ensure the representation Africa needs and the justice you deserve, including with 2 permanent members of the Security Council. And we will keep pressing together for an international financial architecture that is no longer outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. Correcting age-old injustices is essential to address here and now challenges. And the good news is that we have many of the solutions we need. Last year, you helped drive that effort at the United Nations with the Pact for the Future. And I thank Africa for its support that was vital to approve the Pact. Our task now is to make those commitments a reality. South Africa's G20 chairmanship could not come at a better time. Let me point to 4 areas for action. First, we must push for peace, security, and alleviating appalling levels of human suffering. Sudan is being torn apart before our eyes and is now home to the world's largest displacement crisis and famine. As we near the holy months of Ramadan, it is time for an immediate cessation of hostilities. And the international community must come together to stop the flow of weapons and the bankrolling of bloodshed. In the Democratic Republic of the Congolese people have been suffering yet again from a brutal cycle of violence. And the fighting that is raging in South Kivu as a result of the continuation of the M23 offensive threatens to push the entire region over the precipice. Regional escalation must be avoided at all costs. There is no military solution. The deadlock must end, the dialogue must begin, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC must be respected. The conclusions of the recent joint EAC-SADC summit offer a way forward, with a renewed call for an immediate ceasefire and new momentum for regional efforts based on the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Now is the time for swift implementation. And you can count on the continued support of the United Nations, including MONUSCO. In the Sahel, the clear and present threat of terrorism is undermining peace, security, and sustainable development. And in Somalia, we are urging predictable funding for the African Union support and stabilization mission, and I hope that our voice will be heard by the Security Council. And as we gather here in Africa, I know all our minds are also very much on Gaza. A resumption of hostilities must be avoided at all costs. The Palestinian people have suffered too much. I welcome efforts by the parties to abide by the ceasefire agreement and urge action for a permanent ceasefire and the release of all hostages. Peace is possible in the Middle East, and that starts with tangible, irreversible, and permanent progress towards the two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Excellencies, on all fronts, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the African Union to advance security, stability, human rights, and rule of law. Excellencies, second, we must keep working together to deliver the AU 2063 agenda and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and drive action on finance. African countries pay up to 8 times more to borrow than developed countries, and 20 are in or at risk of debt distress. The Pact for the Future supports an international financial architecture reform to reflect today's economy, ensuring fair representation and urging effective action on debt relief. And I will stand with Africa as a matter of justice and to right the historic wrongs. Excellencies, third, the climate crisis. Climate disasters are tearing across Africa, destroying lives, upending livelihoods, devastating economies, and inflaming conflict. At the same time, the renewables revolution is unstoppable, and Africa is poised to become a global clean energy powerhouse. Yet, today, Africa receives just 2% of global renewables investment. Realizing Africa's potential requires access to affordable finance, including by implementing the COP29 finance decision fully and on time, and supporting development of roadmap to realize $1.3 trillion a year. Excellencies, Africa has contributed little to the climate crisis, yet is paying the price with record droughts, floods, and heat. Climate justice requires a massive investment in adaptation, with the international community bearing an enormous responsibility. Developed countries must double adaptation finance, and countries must significantly boost the loss and damage fund. Allow me a note. When the loss and damage fund was created, the pledging conference that took place has allowed for an amount that is equivalent at the highest contract for a basketball player in the United States. It is absolutely necessary to make the loss and damage fund an effective instrument to support developing countries in adaptation. And we also need justice when it comes to your abundant critical minerals. Too often, your countries are plundered, bound to the bottom of value chains as others grow rich on your resources. The work of the United Nations Panel on Critical Energy Transition Minerals is designed to help embed justice, sustainability, and human rights across the value chain. Africa's minerals must benefit Africa's people. Excellences, enfin, nous devons agir dans le domaine des nouvelles technologies, notamment l'intelligence artificielle. Près de 2/3 de la population africaine sont privés d'un accès fiable à l'Internet. Nous avons une responsabilité historique, faire en sorte que l'intelligence artificielle profite à l'humanité tout entière et pas seulement à quelques privilégiés, États et compagnie. Le pacte numérique mondial partage les ambitions du pacte numérique africain. Connectivité universelle, renforcement des capacités et une gouvernance responsable de l'intelligence artificielle. Je présenterai bientôt un rapport sur les modèles innovants de financement volontaire et les initiatives de renforcement des capacités afin d'aider les pays du Sud global à exploiter l'intelligence artificielle pour le bien commun. Ensemble, assurons-nous que les promesses seront tenues. Excellences, l'Union africaine et l'ONU sont unis et déterminés à rendre justice à votre continent sans laisser personne de côté. Nous disposons de bases solides pour aller de l'avant. Alors, ensemble, concrétisons ces engagements. Et permettez-moi de dire une dernière phrase dans ma langue maternelle. Digamos com uma só voz, viva África!
I have the Secretary General of the United Nations with me. He will deliver opening remarks and then we will open up the floor for questions. Secretary General, and before I forget, I wanted to introduce, we have also with us, sitting with us, we have Mr. Claver Gatete, who is the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, based here in Addis Ababa. Secretary, if he arrives, yes, we have Parfait Onanga Anyanga, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General for the UN Office at the African Union. So, Secretary General, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Over these past 3 days in Addis Ababa, I have met many leaders from across the continent to discuss challenges across the spectrum. I want to emphasize that despite the many tests facing Africa, we start from a position of strength. As I said in my remarks to leaders this morning, the partnership between the African Union and the United Nations has never been stronger. And this is especially vital time to build, not least And this is an especially vital time to build, not least with South Africa's historic chairing of the G20 this year. Africa is a continent of possibility and hope, but we also cannot sidestep or sugarcoat essential truth. Africa has unique needs, and as the theme of this summit highlights, Africa faces unique obstacles, namely the profound and deeply rooted legacies of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Century upon century of exploitation, decade upon decade of economic, social, and institutional underinvestment, year upon year of neglect. The result, sometimes by accident, but often by design, is a playing field that is stacked against Africa. A United Nations Security Council where Africa still inexplicably lacks permanent representation. And an international financial architecture where the power and place of Africa is not fairly at the table. Correcting age-old injustices is essential to addressing immediate challenges. And my discussions here, broadly speaking, focused on 4 areas. First, boosting sustainable development, investment and affordable finance, which are so crucial, and with just 5 years left to the deadline of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is in the center of these concerns that we are pushing for our reforms of international financial architecture to give developing countries more voice, more power, more representation, and more access to the resources they need. Second, securing climate action and justice to tackle an existential threat that the African people did virtually nothing to create. The truth is that some of the worst storms, some of the worst droughts, some of the worst negative impacts on the economies and societies are in Africa, but Africa is not contributing to climate change. Third, making sure that Africa is not left behind in the technology race. When it comes to opportunity and capacity building in artificial intelligence, AI must stand for Africa included. And fourth and fundamentally, achieving and sustaining peace throughout the African continent. Yesterday, I was honored to take part in a special session of the African Union Peace and Security Council. We focus on the crisis of Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And my messages were clear. Despite nearly 2 years of fighting in Sudan, every day brings horrific new reports of civilian killings, human rights abuses, and sexual violence. Hate speech and ethically motivated attacks are on the rise, and the economy is in free fall. More weapons flow, and more war means more suffering and instability for the region and far beyond. There is no military solution. And in the spirit of Ramadan, which is about to begin, it is time for an immediate cessation of hostilities. The Sudanese people need a clear path out of this nightmare, and the world needs a stable, peaceful Sudan. In the DRC, as more cities fall, the risk of a regional war rises. It's time to silence the guns. It's time for diplomacy and dialogue. The recent joint summit in Tanzania offered a way with a renewed call for an immediate ceasefire. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC must be respected. There is too much at stake. The Congolese people and the people of the region deserve peace. Across the continent, we will continue to work for peace from Sahel to Somalia and beyond. And we will keep strengthening our many joint efforts with the African Union for security, stability, human rights, and the rule of law. The challenges are great, but the opportunities are greater. And the United Nations will be with the people of Africa every step of the way, and I thank you.
Now open the floor for questions. Since we are in Ethiopia, let me start with an Ethiopian media. OBN, go ahead, you have the floor. Yeah, please use your microphones and try to limit yourself to one question at a time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Welcome to the land of origin. I'm Mambo Makasa and journalist.
Can you bring the micro a little bit closer to you because I'm a bit deaf?
That's right. Can you hear me now? That's right. My question is on the recent international conference on finance for development, and even now you have raised as the financial architecture has to be reformed, and as the proposal is being developed by your agency, UN. And can you brief us the progress of that proposal? Thank you, sir.
The proposal?
Yes, proposal to, as you have, submitted proposal to reform the financial architecture in the IMF.
The international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and others were created after the Second World War. The African continent was practically not represented because most of today's African countries were still at colonial regime. And the system that was created was a system adapted to 1945, and the system that would essentially serve the interests of those that created it. Now the world has changed dramatically, and now the overwhelming majority of the countries of the world are developing countries. And we need to reform the system, the international financial architecture, in order to give much more voice, representation, and power to the developing countries, translating it into a number of new, more effective mechanisms to support development in continents like Africa. We need more concessional funding, which means multilateral development banks need to be reformed in order to be bigger, to be bolder, to be more capitalized, but at the same time more able to attract private investment towards the developing countries. We need to look seriously into the debt question. Many African countries are drowning in debt, and there is no effective mechanism of debt relief. It's important to create that mechanism of debt relief, of effective debt relief. And so there is a number of very important reforms that we have been put on the table, whose orientation was approved in the Summit of the Future, but now we must make sure that the meeting in Seville will be a meeting of implementation.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions in the room. I'll try to get to as many as I can. Let me go to AFP. One question per person so we can get as many as possible.
Hello, Secretary General. I wanted you to react to what a spokesperson for the European Union said this morning on the crisis in DRC. He said that the EU considers all the means at its disposal for a ceasefire in DRC. So what do you think those means should be? Should it be a military intervention? Should it be sanctions? Thank you.
I do not know what means the European Union is thinking about. I know the means that the African Union is thinking about. And let's be clear, this will be solved if there is effective Africa unit and Africa diplomacy to solve the problem. The contribution of other continents like Europe will of course be important, but the key to the solution of the problem is here. That is why it was so important to have the joint SADC East African Community Summit. That in that summit it was defined a clear pathway for a ceasefire, and we believe that an immediate ceasefire is absolutely crucial. On the other hand, it's absolutely crucial to stop the fighting in order not to extend the area of fighting, because the risks of regional expansion are very high at the present moment since the offensive into Bukavu. And at the same time, there are a number of important things that were agreed and now need to be put in place. One is the neutralization of the FDLR, the other is the retreat of the Rwandese forces, and at the same time to have diplomacy and dialogue guaranteeing that the territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo is maintained, and that we will move into a situation in which there is unity in the way a country is governed. That is a complex way to go, But I've seen African leaders determined to do that, and whatever help can come from other continents, of course, will be welcome. But the key to the solution of this problem is here. I always thought that African solutions are always the best way to tackle African problems.
Let me go to the lady just here, and then I'll go to the other room, to the other. We'll get it. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Dabia. I am from Al Jazeera. So my question is, how long will the United Nations remain unable to put an end to the tragedy of the Palestinian people in Gaza? And how can it pressure for the entry of humanitarian aids? And how do you interrupt Trump's decision?
Sorry, I didn't understand this. After how long does it take to solve the problem?
And entry for the humanitarian aids.
And then?
The entry of humanitarian aids in Gaza. And the other question is, how do you interrupt Trump's decision to impose sanctions on South Africa and put traffics on BRICS? It will undermine trade movement in Africa?
So the U.S.
The sanctions that Trump put.
Not the sanctions, the stop.
Thank you.
Foreign assistance.
Well, the UN has not the power to stop the fighting in Gaza and to guarantee the UN by itself at the present moment that we move with determination for the only possible solution, which is a two-state solution, with a Palestinian state side by side with the Israeli state. We know that we do not have a Security Council that probably is prepared for that. But the UN is doing everything possible to support the diplomatic efforts that were taken in order to guarantee the ceasefire and the release of hostages. And now it's absolutely vital that the negotiations for phase 2 and phase 3 are successful. It would be inconceivable that the war would start in Gaza again. The suffering of the Palestinian people would be absolutely intolerable. So our objective now, supporting Qatar, supporting Egypt, supporting the efforts that the United States also had recently, is to make sure that the war does not start again, and that the phases 2 and 3 of the negotiations are successful. And then, I hope progressively, to create the conditions for a solution, and the only solution that is acceptable, in my opinion, is a two-state solution. It would be inconceivable to have millions of Palestinians being expelled from the land where they live, as it would be impossible to accept that those Palestinians would live without any rights in a country, in the land that they always have lived in. The humanitarian aid has had a dramatic increase since the ceasefire. I would remind you that in the past it was said that from the Israeli side that all conditions were there, it was the UN that was not efficient. And the UN would say that the problem are the obstacles that are created. As soon as the obstacles were removed with the ceasefire, the humanitarian aid has boomed. But being as it is, growing enormously, it is always not enough for the needs of 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza that now live in the middle of ruins, as you know. So we need to do more and more and more, because nothing is enough for a people that is in so dramatic circumstances. But I can promise that we are doing everything we can to make sure that the Palestinian people has access to the minimum necessary to avoid the most traumatic situations that the community is facing. South Africa. I have to say that we have an enormous hope in relation to the South Africa presidency of the G20, and we consider that this is an important opportunity to bring the interests of developing countries to the forefront. And in that regard, we would not be so favorable to anything that could be an obstacle to the success of that presidency.
Al-Arabi.
Thank you. Dawood Hassan, Al-Arabi TV. Mr. Secretary General, how much time we need to see the world order collapse? How long time we need to see the world or the international order collapsed after we see something like United States sanctions against the ICC, after we see United States plans to evacuate the people of Gaza? And the second question is, there is a lot of conflicts in Africa. Is there any mechanism or capability to the African Union to resolve or to deal with this great struggling, like in Sudan, in Congo, something like this? Thank you very much.
Well, it is clear that a world order based on the rule of law is under threat. It's essential to preserve the values of the Charter, international law, international humanitarian law, international criminal justice. All these elements are necessary. Many of them are under attack. They have been under attack several times in the past, and they have survived, and they will survive. And I believe in a world in which the law is the reference that is preserved. In relation to the African Union, something very important has been obtained in the Security Council. Many of these situations cannot be solved with peacekeeping forces. We see that today in the DRC, a peacekeeping force is not able to solve the problem because there is no peace to keep. And that is the reason why we managed, after 5 years of constant struggle, to have the Security Council approving the creation of African Union peace-enforcing operations, but peace-enforcing operations funded at 75% by assessed contributions of the United Nations. And this is the instrument we believe will be more important for the African Union. And we sincerely hope that this instrument will be fully applied in Somalia with the renewal, as you know, of the African Union mission in Somalia.
Al-Shark, Bloomberg, and if I have time, I'll go back.
Yes, Khalid Awais from Sharq News Channel. Can you confirm that you called during the closed session last night for international investigation in Sudan? And do you have any contacts?
International investigation?
International investigation in Sudan. And do you have any contacts recently with the two parties in Sudan, SAF and RSF? Thank you.
Yesterday I didn't call for international investigation, but I've been calling in other occasions. But yesterday, as a matter of fact, I didn't use that call. Indeed, my special envoy, Lamambra, has been in contact with the two sides. I myself have had some sporadic contacts, but it is Lamambra that is doing the job, and we believe that it is absolutely essential that the holy month of Ramadan is used in Sudan to stop the fighting and to create the conditions for diplomacy finally to be possible.
We'll do one final question. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Yvonne Katsande. I'm with LN24 International. My question to you is that has the United Nations really fulfilled its mandate in terms of fostering peace in the world, and obviously looking at Africa, because even President Trump withheld his contribution to the United Nations, citing that, you know, some of the NGOs and the work that is being done is not supporting what the United Nations is actually supposed to do. We recently found out that USAID was sponsoring terrorism. So has the United Nations actually done its part fully? And even with the vaccine agenda, it actually turned out to be a debacle. mRNA vaccines were killing people. Why didn't the United Nations actually advocate that it should have been stopped during the COVID-19 era? Thank you.
Thank you.
Mandatory vaccines are killing people.
Well, there are many questions at the same time. Let's go to the central one. Obviously, we have a problem in the United Nations, and that problem is related to the geopolitical divides. And the geopolitical divides make the Security Council most times ineffective when we have serious crises. And so it's very difficult for the UN, with a paralyzed Security Council, play an effective role in relation to the solution of many of the conflicts that we have in the world. And that is why the reform of the Security Council is so important, and that is why I insisted once again today for that reform. In relation to mandatory vaccination, I never advocated for mandatory vaccination. I advocate for a strong campaign in order to convince people that the vaccination is important. That is the policy that we have adopted very clearly during the COVID time, and I think that that policy was effective, even if we had to fight against a lot of misinformation and disinformation with complete lies about vaccines and the risks of vaccines. But I believe that in the end, vaccination was crucial to contain the COVID, and as I said, I'm not advocating for mandatory vaccination, but I'm advocating for a very active action of governments and the civil society in order for vaccination to be accessible to everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is all the time that we have. Thank you. So do you want to take
Last question.
last question?
Thank you. My name is David from Reuters. Just one last question on DRC. You have expressed your concern and you call on the warring parties to resolve the problem in DRC. Just today, we've seen a statement from the head of Uganda National Army, or the Chief of Army, General Muhoozi, threatening force of the National Army of DRC to surrender. He was telling them, he actually posted on his official X account, telling the National Army of DRC to surrender. So seeing such a rhetoric from people with power and position, are you concerned that the conflict in DRC will escalate into a regional war?
We are not asking anybody to surrender. What we are asking is a ceasefire and a political, diplomatic effort in order to make sure that the war ends and in order to make sure that the normal situation is restored.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Secretary General.